like Hollywood, for example, has made us really partial to these narratives that are black and white, good versus bad, right?
Yeah, get
This
the
guy's
bad
bad and
guy.
this guy's
Yeah.
good. Right. But when you're looking at nation states or some of these other actors, there's a lot of gray area, and a lot of power as it functions today is transnational. It's not exclusive to any one government, right? You have the rise of the multinational corporation. And then going back to what I said about Samuel Pisar and the trans ideological corporation, there's been a particular faction of very powerful business people going back decades that wanted to create a block of corporations more powerful than the nation state. And I mean, I think that has definitely happened when you look at the tentacles of, giant asset managers like BlackRock all over the world, or, Blackstone and all of these other entities. I think it's pretty clear that capital and power have transnational flows, and it's very hard to say, it's exclusive to this group and exclusive to that. At the end of the day, it's a lot more complex than we've been led to believe, and I think a lot of people like the easy, simple story, so we can all say this is the one bad guy. But at the end of the day, I think what people need to realize is that the system is completely rigged and it's corrupt, and it's time, like you said earlier, to get local and start building some sort of parallel system, because the only way to starve the existing system is to stop using it, and we have to figure out how to do that, and we have to do that relatively quickly.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. My name is Andy Libson. I'm a teacher here in Oakland and a socialist. And again, we're joined by Kenny Zepeda, who lives in the Central Valley and is also a socialist. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode. And as you can see, we do not have Eduardo here again today. We know we've promised him back each week, but he's definitely, kind of going through some things in Colombia to make sure he can stay in Colombia. So it's kind of stressful, and he's really just dealing with some of the immigration stuff that comes up for people who travel outside of their country. As much as, I guess, Anna Lucas, the woman, is that the woman we interviewed, who said that a U.S. passport is like a walk in the park anywhere. Do you want to go? That's not always true. And Eduardo's coming up against that in Colombia. Anyway, Kenny, you and I are here today, and I guess we're going to be doing kind of a part 2 in relationship to our last episode, or rather, we're going to be discussing some things that came up for you in another discussion. Last week's episode was Jimmy Dore interviewing Whitney Webb, and we talked about where do we agree with Whitney Webb and where do we not, really using that interview as a basis for trying to interrogating our own views about things, about what's really happening in the world today. And I guess today we're looking at an interview that came up between Kim Iversen and who interviewed Whitney Webb. The title of the episode is the three pillars of power: Whitney Webb on intelligence, organized crime, and corporate power. And I think the central question that was taken up was like, who's behind this? And then they went from there. It was an interesting interview. So you said you sent it to me right after we had done the last episode, saying there's some really interesting stuff here. And I was like, okay, well, let's talk about it.
Yeah. It definitely provoked something in me, because by the time I sent it to the group, I had only seen the first 6 minutes, which is, the first 10 minutes or so is the most interesting part of it for me, because there is the question, right, of how does power work? How does this system work? That Kim Iversen throws, right? And she starts with posing some options. Whether is there someone, like a person or an individual or a small group of individuals, like behind the web, or how is it that basically the world works, and I think Whitney tries to answer from her point of view, and I think like on the surface, it might seem that we might agree on some stuff, but I think there are some fundamental assumptions in her answer to, how power works. And, for me, again, the title of the episode talks about these three called institutions, right? Like intelligence, what is it? Organized crime and corporate power, right? And for starters, for me, they're not different. It's just the sum. Like corporate power is hidden behind a web of legality and the protection of doing things on the surface, right? Versus organized crime, and I do agree with her that these things are meshed together. But I have a problem with. Going through the connections, and it was something that I struggled with when we listened to Alison McDowell when we talked about how this person is linked to that person and that person is linked to that person, because to me that almost like obscures how the entire system works, and how is it that, in my view, replacing a person is not going to change anything, or just calling or again, an implicit assumption I think that Whitney makes is that um, the system is being corrupted, that is gone bad. Like for example, the voting system in the U.S. That somewhere along the line it just deviated because there is bad characters, right? And there's also something that you brought up in the last show that also leads us on the road to like talking about individual policies or individual solutions. um and I just want to start there, because that's what kind of got me thinking that I think I disagree with this premise that the system has been corrupted. I do think there is an intensification of some processes that are happening, but I would disagree with her on that.
Yeah, and just to say that when she brings up organized crime, intelligence, and corporate power, that is she's written 2 books now that really try to trace out that almost 100-year history of how organized crime became more connected to how it is connected, and maybe became more connected to the CIA and intelligence, and then goes on in later. When I've only read part of the beginning book, which more emphasizes how intelligence was developing ties to organized crime. So this is a major area of work for her, and like she's written, like we said, 2 books about it and articles about it. Um, and it's clear that she does see these institutions in play. I found it difficult to read that book, to be honest. I was telling Jake Kleisik about this because he writes for Unlimited Hangout and knows Whitney Webb, and I was just like, man, I love her work and I like her articles, but I found that book difficult to read because although she's talking about institutions, she just talks about name after name after like individuals, and I just found it very difficult. It was like being at a party where I didn't know anyone, and just all these names are getting dropped over and over again, and then that person's name comes back up again, and you're supposed to remember that that person was connected to that institution. And I really struggled to make sense, and I found myself getting bored by what I was reading, even though I'm interested in when I've heard interviews of her talk about this stuff. It's very interesting to me because it does match what, like you said, what I would say the world is like, because there's no difference between what is called organized crime and corporations. Corporations are organized criminals. They're the biggest criminals. They do the most theft of people's wages, of people's. They steal from people daily, and we're not just about corporate crime. I mean, literally, about wages or theft. So it it to say that what you have is essentially a set of legal criminals calling another set of people criminals, and they're both criminals. They're all crooks. And the only thing you can say is that the folks who are often called organized crime are sometimes independent of the system. But what Whitney Webb is pointing out is no, they are not. They are wrapped in it. And I actually think that they're not independent. Like I think she's right that they are just as embedded within it. And and what she was kind of trying to use is sort of like talking about Jeffrey Epstein as not like some sort of anomaly. Like the system is blackmail and intrigue of this sort is a piece of how the system holds itself together, as people basically use information they have on you to force you to do things they want you to do. And organized crime takes the form in many ways of generating funds for institutions in another way so that they can do things off the books. And so it's like the Iran Contra scandal kind of thing, where the CIA was trying to figure out how do they fund the Contras. Contras were in El Salvador or Nicaragua? Nicaragua, yeah. How do they fund the Contras without taking any money from the U.S. coffers? So so that kind of thing, and organized crime operated in that way. So I think her work is valuable, but I do find it like I think it's more important to talk about how institutions relate to each other than to talk about all these different individuals. And to Whitney Webb's, I guess, credit, I'm not sure. This is not about Whitney Webb. We're using this as because we both respect her work and respect her ideas. I think that's why we like using her way of looking at it as to say, well, how do we look at it? But when Kim Iversen said she was trying to hope to see who was behind this, Whitney Webb didn't say, well, you're never going to find the person behind it because it's not about an individual. But at the same time, she also didn't say, well, here are the people. She just said it's complicated. And that, again, I don't find that a sufficient answer. I think the answer is you will never, if you look at people, you will never find the answer for what's really going on, because what you're looking at is institutions and how institutions work and what are their interests. And you're looking at classes, really, when it comes down to it. I would say, of course, Marxist, but you're looking at class interests and how they're playing out, and then what institutions are behind one set of class interests. And if we're talking about building an alternative, what class is behind these alternative institutions that are built? Because she does mention alternative. So I just want to. I'm not sure if that was a ramble, but I just wanted to say, yeah.
I think that's a very important point, that to look at the institutions, right, rather than individuals, because I too get lost in disconnected, and just it's hard to follow. But once I look at, for example, like organized crime, whether it's a cartel or the mob, and how they interact with the state, the official, the legal, right, like the validated authority, the wielders of coercive legal violence, right? But again, like they are in bed, they are connected, and at times I feel like these institutions have been at odds with each other. They're not, always acting, pushing the same way. They are levers of power. That's how I see it, and that at times they have been aware, and they also, like, people want to get to the table, or these institutions get to the table of how power is wielded through different means and methods, right? Like, obviously, you have the old oligarchs, the Hearst, the Rockefellers, the families that whose last names but then you have the Al Capones, right, and the people who come through other means and ask and push the door into the table, because there is other ways of exerting power in society, rather than just like through the government. There is, like you said, there is extortion, even though some of the things that are labeled deemed legal is extortion, but under the facade of legality.
Yeah.
But my point being is that, or for example, take the tech industry, right? They themselves kind of push and carved out a level of space at the table to lever and drive the world, and so I do think they do have a class interest. They're not all always in agreement, as to how to proceed forward. And that's why, again, it doesn't matter if you remove an individual, if you remove Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Hoover, right, who was a mobster too, or Bill Gates or Elon Musk, and because the institution perdures and continues, right? And they do synthesize to form this thing, this class that rules everyone. And at the end of the day, I do think they understand how power, works, in to each in their own, sphere of influence. And so, but again, it's not useful. Like, I don't care if Biden wins. I don't care if Trump wins. I don't care who's, if Lloyd Austin, a black man, is fucking, Secretary of Defense, right? It's still the same because the institution is doing the thing that it's supposed to do to keep a seat at the table.
So I think you and I agree on that, and that to me is one of the areas where we would differ in terms of how we would look at things. But the other thing that Whitney Webb said was that that corporations and the intelligence and and organized crime were now forming like a what's it called? Not a cartel, a kind of a cartel, a cartel that was actually operating at a level that was transnational and was actually, kind of like pushing aside the state. And that, in some ways, when she spoke about the problem is like she spoke as the state interest no longer being active. Now we have these transnational interests that are building and growing. And I wonder what you make of that, like, because she wasn't going to say to Kim Iversen, "Oh, it's this person or that person. You can't do it that way." And so she didn't. Even though I think the nature of that kind of work, where you give this name and that name and that name, it tends to get people to say, "Well, who are the people that we're looking for?" And Whitney Webb is like, "Well, there's no people per se." But then what she is saying is that these specific organizations, corporations combined with organized crime, combined with the intelligence, is actually starting to create a kind of a transnational global web, like she mentioned BlackRock and Blackstone, and saying that these are the actual, maybe that would be the institution of power and things like that. And so what do you make of that? How would you assess? Because that's where I do think she did kind of, I'm not going to say clear about that, but that was something where she said, no, this is how it's working.
I mean, I do think there is a process, right? Like a global process that's has happened. I think that Marxism has some answers to that, in terms of trying to analyze what has happened, right? In terms of like the consolidation of power, right? And that is sort of like how it's not corruption of the system. It's just how the system works itself, to be. And to me, in my view, that in there is, I think, but I mean that collaboration. I don't know how far back we're looking, because I think, like, at least in modern history, they've always been together. Like, and let's look back into the 1900s. To me, that these institutions have, danced with each other and colluded and synthesized in one way or another. And so, when it comes to like institutions like BlackRock, who manage, the financial system, right? Like, they have tons of assets into this system that we think is linked to the real economy, which, it's huge questions, and in my way, it's not. They don't produce shit in reality. They do have the ability in this system to wield people to do things, and they still need those other institutions to get shit done. Like, they need the legal system, right? Like, the state, in order to execute some of their their wills, their will. They also need illicit, activity, quote unquote illicit, or like, bending someone's arm. They should look at the death of environmentalists all over the world, in the third world. They're always dying because they're competing against some corporation, or they're posing a threat to some corporation. And so, but I do think the system itself is in crisis, and is becoming more evident in terms of things that we talked about in the last episode. And I guess Fabio Vighi is where like provides some sort of picture for me in terms of why there is multinational efforts to kind of consolidate some sort of new form of governing in hurting people in different ways. I don't know if that's that would be what comes to mind.
I think that's clear. I think you might agree with Whitney Webb more than I do on that, because this is an area where I think people have an illusion that somehow the state is being pushed aside, or the state, like that these corporations are breaking out of the like a chrysalis breaking out of its cocoon kind of thing, and that they're shattering the state and becoming bigger than the state, like BlackRock, bigger than the state. I think that illusion happened prior to World War I, where you had larger corporations that had holdings not just in the United States, but in Germany and in Russia and in Europe, and they made investments in the enemy. And at times there were differences within U.S. capitalism with capitalists who were supporting the enemy that they're going after. And time to Germany, and Ford is a famous one who was like, he wanted to go with Hitler because he thought they would fight the Bolsheviks more like would be more a better bulwark against Bolshevism than others, but here's the question in some ways: will BlackRock stop World War III from happening? And they won't. Like, BlackRock is going to have to choose a side ultimately. Like, the institution of BlackRock, in my opinion, is not running this country. They're not running this globe. I would say the globe is still run by the capitalist class, organized under nation states. And yes, they have multinational corporations that allow them to grab resources in their colonial holdings, and then sometimes link themselves in places where U.S. That's why people were like, well, U.S. has all this money in China. Yes, because at one point they thought that they were going to get over on China, and it looks like China is getting over on them. And now the worm is turning, and now it's about tariffs and doing essentially economic acts of war, which were the same precursors to World War I. The same sorts of things about raising trade barriers and that kind of stuff were the same sorts of things that were the beginning bell of indicating that the big global capitals that were organized into nation states were going to fight, that internationalism was going to end in national fighting and nationalist fighting. And when that happens, BlackRock's going to have to pick a side. BlackRock's going to have to decide if it's China, if its home base is China, or if its home base is the West. Personally, I think it's going to link itself to the West, and it will. And because I do believe the West is going to be defeated, I think we're going to see BlackRock not be the big thing that we all think it is. And I think I don't think we get out of World War III alive, or rather in any meaningful way. The world will be completely different, in my opinion. But if one can do the thought experiment, I think China and Russia are in the seat of being the victor, and in the same way the U.S. was the victor coming out of World War II, and it will be institutions that come out of that state that are going to be multinational, and Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia building up all sorts of pipelines everywhere, and that's what the world would look like in a post-U.S. It will be hegemony of the China-Russia axis, and they themselves would start to conflict, I think, after times. But that's neither here nor there. I'm saying that I think states still are the defining feature of capitalism, because they define the identity of the working class that are exploited at home by that local capitalist class, and it's the basis by which they put those workers under one flag. And it establishes the borders that say this is what our property is, and this is the base from which we accumulate profits, and then we extend ourselves beyond those borders if we are a particular type, particularly if we're an empire. And then there's big empires like the United States and sub empires like Iran, and we will find ourselves using our capital beyond our border in ways that make it so that we can accumulate more capital, can accumulate more resources, make sure that we are a power center, and also keep other power centers out of those regions. And that's what they will do. And so that fundamentally, I disagree with the notion that transnational corporations are some sort of, again, new development of capitalism, and that they are going to be the new feature that runs it. I think there were similar illusions that were had even among socialists back in World War I, where they thought of this notion of hyper-imperialism, where all the capitals would essentially unify into one, and they would run the globe like a giant monopoly. And that's I think Whitney Webb's vision, and I think this is a vision that's common among people who are critical of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I think they have this belief that the end game for our enemy is one big octopus, giant cartel controlling the globe, and we are in a prison planet underneath that. And that's not what, in my opinion, what's going to happen. This is going to end in competition, and it's going to end in violent competition.
And so I don't.
And violent state competition, defined by states, and people are going to have to, and institutions are going to have to choose sides when the missiles start flying and when the troops start marching. It's not a question. You won't be able to play both sides forever.
I don't think that like BlackRock is running things. I do think that in this particular time of the financial system, they do have a lot of sway. But that's what I say, that they still need the state to execute, and validate them. And because the state wills, control and violence, right? Because I mean, look at the thing that Putin gets accused of, right? Like, or the Prince of Saudi Arabia, right? Like, yeah, you can have all the fucking money you think you have, but if you don't have the state behind you, this is why Nancy Pelosi is more powerful than fucking Bill Gates, and Elon Musk, and she's untouchable. She's about to die, and she's fucking untouchable. Like I do see, like you, that the state is ultimately the central player, that are going to come into head. We agree on that. We've talked about that in previous episodes. That in the state, right, is what represents the ruling class. And that state is going to do the bidding of the ruling class. And so, and obviously, BlackRock does have some influence, but and there is people, and there is, like, I think that's what Whitney Webb is trying to point out, that there is connections and embeddedness, right? And there are things that overlap. There's people that overlap interests, but when, like, the borders are strictly enforced, right, in a world war situation, and it becomes a material, act of exerting power, then BlackRock is obsolete. And yeah, they have money everywhere. They're hedging their bets everywhere, that they can. But assuming that the system survives, right, in some capacity, and that's where I question, like, whether this CBDC thing, right, like Whitney Webb brought it up, is a threat to that institution of the financial system, right? Like, because if it is centralized, right, and I don't know, I'm still thinking through it, but I do wonder if it's a threat, because that's what I was, and I think similarly to Jeff asking that question, I will move into a new system. I mean, the system is changing, evolving in some way. And so, but it does come back to who wills the ability to have the coercive apparatus, right? Whether it be like the threat of legal action, the threat of calling you a terrorist, a person that has the wrong kind of thinking and thoughts, an enemy of the state. The state is, the powerful player here, because if you don't have the force behind you, like, Bill Gates can go to jail. If he doesn't play by the rules of the state, he will be called, he will be exposed, by the things that he's being beholden to, right? Because I do think this is how these people stayed in that system, because in order to get there, you have to get your hands dirty, right? This is how Kamala Harris got to be the vice president of the United States. This is how Biden got to be the president. And on that note too, like, Biden's psychological state, right, like a mental state, also demonstrate that there is an institution that governs. It's not the fucking president of the United States. He's just a fucking puppet, going and trying to speak, but the institution functions without him. But again, I do agree with you. The state is ultimately what is gonna play out. The worst case scenario, which is global war. In I don't know if it will necessarily be like a sudden death, or a death by 1,000 cuts. With a lot of proxy wars that will intensify, and so.
Yeah, I mean, again, this debate that exists among people who are fighting for freedom around the nature of the state, the most common thing you hear from them is how state interests are being subordinated to international interests and to globalist interests and to things like that. And implied behind that is that somehow we've got to get back to some earlier place when the state was, if you will, there to protect us. That period of time never existed. The state has always been a tool of power and violence for the capitalist class, violence against the working class, violence against working class in its home state. So if you're in the United States, it's not just violent to Mexico, and it's not just violent to South America, or violent to the Philippines, or violent to China, or violent to even Germany. It is first and foremost violent to its own people. And one of the pieces of evidence of that is the fact, like, this is small, but like Pearl Harbor was a setup, right? We will kill our own soldiers. We will destroy our own stuff in order to create the opportunity for us to go to war, so that the U.S. capitalists can put themselves in a position at the right time and place, so that they will be the global hegemons coming out of World War II, which is what they hope to do. And secondly, we will annihilate, hundreds of thousands of Japanese, so that Russia gets the right idea. Because again, the reason I believe the using of the nuclear bomb had nothing to do with ending the war. It was an object lesson to its future competitors that you don't fuck with us. We're the big power. This is what we can do. So they were just testing out their shit on the Japanese to show to the Russians and to the Soviet Union, bow to us, essentially. So it was really the first. It was the beginning. Destroying Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in my opinion, was the U.S. state saying we're starting our Cold War now just coming out of fighting Germany. We're going to fight a so-called ally, Soviet Union, which was an ally in that war. So I think that there is a lot. That misunderstanding about the nature of the state is again why people also come back to defending borders, because we want to eliminate that state, and people are going to hear under that globalism and like that, but that state is the power that is one of the major forms of capitalist power that they use to keep us under control. So that state has to be eliminated. And if you defend a border, you are empowering that state. And so that's one of the reasons why we need a borderless world. One of the reasons why I welcome other fellow workers cross whatever border, because I don't believe those borders should exist, because those borders exist to control us and either imprison us or to control our movement. And so again, that area is another area where often me and you and Eduardo are in the minority among people who are saying they're fighting for freedom, because they want to keep those borders. And in the same way that I think that the state is truly a power center of capitalism and one that's going to dominate in terms of how capitalism will play out. The border is one of those things that has to go, and I suspect it is also one of the reasons why people go to saying that even the notion of a war extending and a war getting to the point where nukes are flying, and it's pretty much it's not going to be a very survivable world. I think people will survive, but it's a completely different. It's like essentially civilization is destroyed as we know it. I think there are people who think that's not going to happen because they do think that there's this overarching controller, whether it be like an institution like BlackRock and things like that, that just won't let it get to that point. And that's again another area where I disagree.
There is a question I have. So, I mean, we're putting a lot of emphasis on the state, right?
Yeah.
And so, if the state is the biggest player, right, like or it wields a lot of power, right, in this, why is it a capitalist system? Does that question make sense?
No, can you ask it again?
So, if the state, not the financial institutions, right, because it is the one who wields the power in this in the world we live in, and they're not necessarily the same.
Well,
Like, how would you explain that?
well, first off, that's one of the tricks of capitalism is they keep separate their political realm and their economic realm are kept separate. Um, Obviously, if the fundamental feature of capitalism is its economic wing, it's a system around which production is organized around profit making. Um, Now, on that wing, we understand that's a dictatorship. The boss can hire and fire you. Okay, workers can try to organize for like rights, but the economic wing is a clear dictatorship. People talk about freedom, and generally what libertarians are talking about is the freedom of the corporations to move around and exploit. Um, so, yes, capitalism doesn't just exist in the political world, which the political organization of capitalism is organized around states, in my opinion. Um, it's but it is an economic system, and so the state is still a superstructure to a fundamental relationship of capitalists exploiting workers across the globe. But it takes the form of its primary political organization is organized around nation states. That's, I guess, how I would put it. And those two things work well together by the fact that they're kind of kept separate from one another. And they're not really separate. Well, the way you organize, how you organize society is connected to how you produce goods. But in this regard, that's I think a kind of a feature of capitalism is that they are kept as separate spheres. I do think it would be wrong for people to assume that like these things weren't determined by states. The states emerged, nation states emerged out of the development of capitalism, but they are to me they are going to be the political features, the political institutions that we are going to see take on more and more meaningful form in terms of how the world plays out. And it's why Russia said it's going to go to war, because it basically one state said we're going to create an actual alliance with another state, Ukraine, and we're going to put that into NATO, and we're going to potentially put defense weapons there, which really are just possible missiles right on the border up there. And they know they're enemies. These are state enemies at this point, capitalist competitors. And so Russia was like, you can't do this. And if you do it, we're going to go to war. Just like the U.S. did around Cuba. So but why is this happening? It's happening. And because increasingly profits are, the rate of profit is falling. That's the economic thing that's happening. But that's meaning that the state institutions are having to be wielded more and more to make sure that for their local capitalists, the world is free for them to exploit. And that is now the beginning of the competition we're going to see, that I think is going to take more and more. That competition is ultimately going to be decisive, and I believe how this thing plays out, which is why I do think it ends. If it doesn't end in revolution, meaning we get rid of the capitalist system by some act of workers, then it does end in World War III.
And I think that just to maybe try to add to this, at least idea, especially I think in the Western world, that the private institutions, right, like businesses and the state are like completely separate entities, right? Like, um, it's a facade that's kept up, but it's becoming more evident if you dig enough that they're not, right? Like we talked about censorship in like social media, right? And there's been some evidence, I guess, or that the state was exerting a lot of influence on how to get that done, right? But it helps, and so I guess if we believe everything that we are told about China and Russia, right? Like they have gotten to that road, or they don't have that facade. That facade is less, less intense. Whereas we're still pretending like, we're not going to censor it's Twitter or X, whatever. They're choosing to do that to regulate, thought. We're not gonna force. This is Whitney Webb's argument on the past episode. We're not gonna force central bank digital currency. Banks are gonna do it, and so using the independence of the businesses or institutions to pretend that the state is not behind that, right? That exertion of regulating its population.
Yeah. Yes. But I will say that, and one thing people think, this is why people call China socialist, is because it's seemingly state-run industries. It's why they thought of the former Soviet Union as socialist, whereas I would not. I would say that what you had was capital accumulation, surplus value extracted from its workers but by state-run industries. So because they were competing, and they were still competing for profits with the United States, because it was the accumulation of those profits that they would use to invest and then have money to get more resources wherever they were trying to get them, and compete for market share wherever they were trying to compete for market share. So there is a global market, because capitalism is global, and so whether you have state capitalism as it is in China or former Soviet Union or not, you still have centers from which capital or the surplus value exploitation surplus value is being extracted from workers, or exploitation of workers is still occurring. And the battle is who can exploit your own working class and accumulate the most capital to which to then invest it and then produce more capital and more growth for yourself. It's a grow game, and it's a game of monopoly, a game of monopoly and risk, I guess to put together. You said one other thing about whether or not there would be central bank digital currency and whether that would represent a threat to the system. I actually think it's a very necessary step towards even greater exploitation of your own population. So whether it takes the form of central bank digital currency, I do think programmable money and digital currency is going to be a future feature of our economy. It already is in China. It already is in Russia. It's already in India. The U.S. is going to have to follow that same course. Will it be central bank run? I don't know. I think Jeff sent us an article about the idea there could be a global currency. I don't see that happening. Again, I think people have this notion that things like the World Economic Forum are places where the whole globe, all the global elite get together and make decisions. And you can see now it's not true. Russia ain't there, and Russia's not showing up for a reason, because Zelensky's there, and and United States there, the World Economic Forum is a Western thing, right? China shows up, but just pretty much shows up to keep its finger in, in their pie, but they have no illusions that the World Economic Forum is their institution. The World Economic Forum is a feature of Western control, which is now coming apart as NATO and Europe and the United States are exposed as not nearly as powerful as many of us thought, and a new power center is building. And so I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going to be much more of a feature of the future, and BRICS, than what we see from these old institutions, which were never global. They were always pushed. There was always state agents behind them pushing a global agenda that was actually really an act of imperialism by particular states. So I guess that's what I would say. And I do think, though, digital currency is a very important part of how of control for the state, and how you are going to, like you said, organize, try to tame the business cycle in your economy by not just controlling production, but controlling consumption. So it's going to be a feature of attempting to control the beast of the business cycle, which is really just the tendency of capitalism to have intermittent crisis. And so they think they can solve that. They cannot. It will not be solved. And in fact, it will extend that crisis. It's going to make that crisis deeper. And so that's why I think as the crisis gets deeper, you've got to go to much more aggressive things to get yourself to recover profits. And that's why I'm convinced we're headed towards calamity, and not global warming calamity. I do think that geoengineering is bad, but I think the one that's right in our face right now is spreading war. And I don't think we're talking about, in my opinion, definitely within what I hope to be just my lifetime, because I still think 2030 to me is like, when I think about the time frame for this, I think between 2030 and 2050, something's going to give between that, like somewhere within there. It ain't going to, someone's going to have to go down. And if somebody goes down, I think nukes have to be used. And it's going to be the United States going down. That's what it looks like. They're going to lose. And they're the ones who are going to use the nukes, or set up the situation where they're able to use their nuclear weapons. That's what it looks like to me.
So this brings me up to, maybe another area of disagreement with Whitney Webb, in terms of, in this question came up right before, like, what do we do? And
I want to talk about that.
also, because Whitney Webb talked about divesting, and honestly, that sort of language is kind of triggering me, because it brings up like liberal thought on problem solving, and basically reforming a system versus understanding that the wheel needs to be broken.
Can I start with what I thought she said? Because I want to see if you would agree, because I felt like I agreed with her on some of those things, which was interesting. Because part of me was like, I disagree with a lot of her analysis, but I agree with a feature of her. So maybe let me say what I think she said, and then you tell me what you think about that, and then can we go from there? Because the biggest thing she kept on talking about, and she did not talk about kind of people have to take personal responsibility, and we have to get out of Amazon and get out of the big corporations, things like that. But she also mentioned building alternative structures, building alternative institutions. I don't know if she used the word institution, but alternative structures, building and I don't disagree with that. Like, I think at least in the short term, that to me feels true. Now, is she saying an alternative to capitalism? I don't think so. But I think, and this is where I would say that for me, if you're knowing that we have to build an alternative, whether you think that's an alternative to capitalism or an alternative to this given system but still you think you're in favor of capitalism, I personally think that I have an ally in this fight right now, because that to me is the most important feature of what needs to be done is getting out of the system. Now, Whitney Webb still thinks that possibly Bitcoin can be worked within it and things like that. So clearly we have differences about how much really we have to get at, how deep we have to get away from their system. But I found in her saying, yes, she just said go local, but I found in her saying we have to build an alternative to this system. That to me is almost enough. And I would say, yeah, I don't think it's about personal responsibility, and we won't be able to divest from them unless we have something we can invest in, or rather we can build, because it's not about an investment. It's about building. It's about humans constructing something for humans. And and there's a problem, because increasingly my Marxism would say the working class, but I'm not really using those terms these days in some ways. I kind of do as almost a holdover. If it is capitalism, and if Marx is right about capitalism, then it is something that where the working class is going to have to feature as a central role in the reorganization of society, building new working class institutions. I agree with that, but for me, Whitney Webb says kind of, I don't think she's probably thinking the same thing I'm thinking, but for me, that's enough. I guess I'll put it that way. That's why I wanted to start, because I found, okay, she at least sees we've got to build some alternative. I don't think she's thinking the same thing as I am, but I don't even know exactly what the alternative. All I can say is it has to get rid of profit system. It has to get rid of production on the basis of accumulating capital.
And so this is the thing that I wonder. So I see that there is two parts to that answer that she gave, and I do think there is, same. I don't, the whole divest and stuff, like that's why I say that triggers something in me that I'm like, I don't think you fully understand the problem. But yes, having something parallel. But this is where I question, and this is because remember when you told me that you talked about your family and going to your mother's you know or whatever place,
Yeah,
and you coming together, but you said that would be, that's the last thing, like because at that point you think it's game over.
yeah. That's not an alternative. Well, I'm not. That's not an alternative. That's just living. That's just staying alive in a situation where capitalism has destroyed the globe, and I just want to live, and I want to live with my loved ones, with some sense of believing, like, I love these people. The earth is wonderful. Life is a gift. Okay, I'm not just going to give that gift up just because the system. Number one, the system destroyed our civilization, and two, the working class fucking didn't have the revolution that it needed to have, and fucking got fooled again. Because that's what happened, right? That's why it goes down. Is the revolutionary class does not seize its moment, and so me going to Columbia, Missouri with my family, and I'll take you and your family in tow. We'll all go there. But my doing that's not parallel society. That's just staying alive. That's already a wrap. Parallel society is me and Brandy staying here and working with people and trying to figure out what do we do to, like, build something around us with our neighbors or things like that. And we haven't really been able to get a grip on that. Parallel society is something you do with thousands and thousands of people, and ultimately it's going to be done by millions and even billions of people building their own parallels in their own areas, and then those things linking up when they need to or not. I think the biggest area they link up in is in the need to ultimately fight a civil war to throw off the rulers who are trying to destroy that parallel society that you all have individually constructed, and you come together to fight the battle of defending your own stuff and removing those institutions who see a threat to your rising up. it's dual power. Like there's one institution, there's a capitalist institution, there's worker class institution. They can't exist forever. Either you're going to have a revolution in which the working class institutions dominate, or you will have a situation where they will crush you, and the old system continues and carries on in whatever way it can. That's why I still think that what Lenin said in 1912, 1914, it's we must turn imperial war into civil war. Civil war is not to me a dirty word like they're throwing it around. Oh, civil war in the United States. Civil war is something we should welcome, because civil war is going to be a feature of keeping the institutions that we are building alive when they're threatened by our class enemies.
It's just I'm processing, because I think that was an important clarification, right? Because this notion of just going into the woods and like just having your own community and shutting everything else out versus like kind of building your own society, because you're not going anywhere. You're saying this, so you're trying to build it with the people around you, right? Because that's what I was again wrestling with in. Because, for example, in San Francisco, at one point when the pandemic, whatever bullshit was going down, we community organizers were distributing food through donations of other people to people who needed it. And but we didn't have spaces to work, and there were empty buildings in the mission. And I made the proposition to take over a building, and kind of say, "Fuck you, real estate. Fuck you, state city. We're running this shit. We're running this thing how we see it fit." But didn't have any legs, because I think that's more of what you're talking about. Saying like we're running this, we're doing it our way. We rose up from the ground. There were leaders that sprung up, in our in the trenches, right, every day. And it makes me wonder, like, if maybe we're not seeing, it fire enough, because I do hear like sort of echoes of what we're talking about in other countries, like in parts, not in all of it. Because like in Guatemala, indigenous people were murdered for decades, and you can explore the history of that. But they were fighting the imposition of capitalism, the ancient ways to, the imposition of private property, and the hundreds of thousands of people died. And to this day, there is parts of the highlands where most of the indigenous community lives. They survived the Spanish. They survived, the imposition of capitalism on them, and so and there are towns. I know there are towns that where the extortion of the cartels, or the extortion of the cops, or the extortion of the military doesn't work on them, because they run their communities. They actually, and again, say what you say, but they lynch cops. They lynch, people who are trying to extort them. And so certain communities are way more peaceful than other parts of the country that are ruled by the supposed cartels, in cahoots with the cops and the state. In Mexico too, there are communities that have armed themselves in order to protect their communities and run their communities. And obviously, there is a question of scalability, right? And how much does it spread, and like how sustainable that is for you know for the pressure that are going to come, to try to exist in that. And so just wanted to throw that out there, that they might be already exercises, the Zapatistas, right? And Eduardo, I think, maybe be better at speaking about some of this stuff, because he brings it up. And it's just a thought that, crosses my mind, because obviously we have to deal with our own context, right? And of things. And but it's just something that comes up to me, and as a possibility for modeling, and certain things, and you know, yeah, and protecting the stuff that we're trying to build, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and and yeah, so just wanted to share that with you.
Well, I do think that those might be models. The only problem is I have no experience with those models, and I don't see anything like that around me. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's the form, if it takes on that kind of form here in the United States. The few things that I think it will require is it will look, me and my family and people, my loved ones, hide hiding out in Missouri. That's just a hideout. That's not changing society. That's hiding out after society's been destroyed. Um, but changing society so that all of us can find a place to live in and humanity can go on with some dignity. Um, that is about, networks of building building connections with each other and being willing to be armed, armed to defend what they have, and then but working, looking to each other more than looking to the state or a corporation or my employer or whatever, but looking more to each other as what we need to exist and go on forward. And then there will need to probably be tethers between these various organizations of humans that are forming that will tie them together, because there's going to need to be a bigger struggle to take on the existing state and the existing system, the existing institutions. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a U.S. version of that. In fact, not. I welcome it. The question of where the working class figures in that is a question for me. Um, you know, it certainly ain't going to be the unions. Randy Weingarten wrote another article like just this last week about we have to do everything we can to save our democracy by getting Joe Biden elected. Which you there we obviously know Trump and Biden. There's nothing to vote for. Blah blah blah. But the idea that the Biden administration has been anything other than an escalation in the authoritarian attack on workers in this country and abroad, like it's just absurd. So unions are not going to feature into this, but how will organized workers? I suspect organized workers are going to have to defeat their unions in order to play a role that's more meaningful in the struggle. I think they're going to have to destroy their unions and form new associations. But what form that takes, how the working class figures into this, I'm really at a loss. But is Marxism will say that the linchpin to revolution is the working class and the organizing of the working class. And much of the descriptions we've seen in those countries where people are being independent, I think those would be described almost more like peasants organizing. They're working, but they're working more like independent. They're not collective workers. They're working more independently, and maybe their collection is to each other in terms of their community. So that's been a criticism that Marxism has had of those sorts of struggles, and the fact that those struggles are not capable of making a broader, ultimately international revolution. I have questions, that's all I can say. And I think right now my questions are deeper than what my own belief is, because I believe that capitalism is the problem. I believe that the working class is a revolutionary class, and yet I struggle to say what specific role will workers play in, and how will we be central in making a new world emerge? I don't know, because most of the things I'm describing in many ways are not connected to workplaces. They're connected. We work maybe, but we're organizing in our community centers and things like that. In the past, I've thought of those things as not really getting the job done. And maybe I still think that, because you do have to take down the profit producing center of the capitalist. And that can only be done by taking down their workplaces. And that is best done by the workers in those places. So maybe I'm answering my own question as I say it, but in stopping their profits, workers must build alternative institutions. If they don't build alternative institutions, and I don't mean unions, because unions are defensive organizations, alternative institutions are institutions of offense, of like, of this is what we're going to be about, and we're going to defend this, and we're no longer going to look to you to organize us. We are organizing ourselves for ourselves and outside of a profit system. Workers are going to have to do that, and that did happen in the Soviet Union. That's what workers' councils were, and but I think they also still kept the organizing of production of the old capitalist system. And I have a question about whether that really is how we would do this. Is whether, yes, we're all organized in workplaces right now, but that's how capitalism has organized us. Is that how we would really be organized in a revolutionary world? I'm not so sure. Does that make sense when I say that question?
No, it does. It does. I also think about you know, like you mentioned thousands and thousands of people, and we've talked about previously about the spread of this, right? Like, and time being of the essence, right? Because you know, we if you want to build a society that can withstand the the reaction, right, of the powers that be, but you're gonna have to take control of the material reality that allows you to live, right? And that's not, a little town here and there, and um because I think that's still somewhat of the difference, right? Like these towns that I mentioned in Mexico or Guatemala, you know, they're they're in a way reacting to their context, right? And of necessity, but they're still linked up to the system as a whole, and they're not necessarily a threat to the entire system. And so it would be a different question, right? To to do what we're talking about, and and I don't know. Again, this is what we talk about. Is what the thing I absolutely am certain about is that and this is what I work for. When I come to the show, to show that we have to reprogram ourselves, or I don't know if that's the fucking term, the unlearn many things. And one of the important things is that these so-called expert mediators of our lives need to go away. That because I think back to San Francisco, right, when I was in the thick of it, and seeing a possibility, and but the dominant current was that we need to work with the city officials to get a place, for us to do our things, and it saddens me because, there is this nonprofit called like Calle 24, and, that they talk up there all about for people. They were advancing the mask mandates. They were like, their posters were everywhere. And on top of that, during the pandemic, a lot of vendors started selling. A lot of people hustling to try to make a living were selling outside the mission, and you know, in they started this project alongside the city to legalize vendors.
Mm.
And then what happened months after? They cleaned up everyone.
Yeah.
And a lot of those vendors are gone. And,
Yeah.
and again, but understanding this fundamental thing that we have to be more skeptical about the people that have been trained in the system, that we're trying to battle, because they are the Trojan horses in my mind. And we have to understand that whatever we're trying to build has to be independent from all this shit, and otherwise, it's gonna go down real quick, and or it becomes the project of someone else,
Yeah.
talk to, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's Black Lives Matter, and even fucking, I don't know if Occupy, also became something else. Uh, you know, uh, so yeah, uh, that to me is like present, that we need to understand and empower each other, that everyone has a stake in it, regardless of your level of indoctrination in the system, which some people call education. But and you know, yeah, getting rid of those hierarchies that are also implanted in our mind.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I want to say is I don't think I know what form, like the the struggle to build something new will take, but I do suspect that some set of workers in China or in Russia or in Brazil or in Guatemala or in France, just like people tried to organize Occupy, it got people excited, and new Occupy centers spread, or the Yellow Vests when those things started. Um, People wanted to reproduce that, or when the Canadian truckers did what they did, people tried to reproduce that, even if they weren't that successful. Or what you see with farmers did in the Netherlands, and now they're doing it in Germany. I think I think once someone makes a breakthrough within the working class in some city, uh, and does something that excites people there and gets out, I think that will be the model that will likely be replicated or attempted to be replicated by workers around the globe. And it won't be because there's going to be international ties between us at that point. It's going to be because we are all under this. There is a global system that's even if even if the globe is constructed around nation states, there is still one system oppressing us, and that is the capitalist system. And it's going. I do think it's going to produce a solution somewhere. And when that solution or that key is unlocked somewhere, that I suspect, I hope, well, I believe that in a very short time, workers can replicate that and try to make it work in their place, and we can see whether that's enough to take to maybe not to take them down at that point, but to really get the capitalists shivering and to put us in a place where we actually have more confidence about us running our lives as opposed to our lives being dictated by Davos elites or the Chinese Communist Party or you know Putin and his state. Because all workers in all across the globe are finding themselves subject to some set of capitalists, one way, shape, or form. And how do they
Mm,
get out from under that? So that to me is maybe the model for how it will happen.
yeah.
But
I do think there is, like, even like the George Floyd thing, right? Like how it spread, in because I do think there are pressures that I think people know, like a lot of people understand, outside of like the Bay Area, these centers that are very like lost in the sauce of liberal politics, or whatever, even conservative, whatever. But I think that most people know, like, there's something wrong, you know, in that energy is unleashed, and when there isn't a possibility of an opening, and then, but it also brings up, right, like how much the people who are trying to rule us all, right, like, because they have the same interests, they are putting so much weight on managing what we see, right, and what we understand of the world, and that's what we have to be aware of. The other institution, right, media, and that includes Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and even Substack, even X, Twitter, whatever. Um, and we've talked about how we have to fundamentally understand that these are not our tools, and be weary of that. And to me, these are also those mediators that I'm talking about, the expert mediators. Um, and um, that's why it's important to talk to people outside of just us too, right? Like to get a pulse on like what the fuck is this person thinking, and and seriously considering someone's opinion, not just like dismissing them for whatever stupid ideas that we ourselves have, been
yeah,
brought to believe. And so, yeah, like I guess finding our own way of getting information,
Well, and I think it's going to be complicated because let's use the China example. Let's say there are workers in China who are actually independent, who are threatening the Chinese state with whatever actions they're doing, and it's at its beginning. Is the U.S. going to get involved in that? Damn well, they definitely going to get involved in that. And then the freedom side will have this question: is that something we should follow, or is that something that is an act of the U.S. state alone? And that we're going to have to be able to answer that question, because if we do something that is threatening to our state, and I hope we do, you damn well know that Russia and China are going to get their fingers into it. Particularly when the because that is likely to happen when the battle for profits is even more pitched, when the likelihood of the war escalating is even more pitched. So Russia and China are going to do anything they can to defeat their enemy, and that's why German money supplied the Bolsheviks, because they were going to help them get into there, because they wanted to bring down the Russian Empire, and they felt the Bolsheviks had the best chance of bringing them down. Little did they know that the Bolsheviks would then try to fraternize with their soldiers and their workers to help them, through the Comintern, bring down the German government. And they did have a revolution in Germany. It just was ultimately defeated, but it was a near revolution. And the Comintern and the Russian communists played a role in that, played a role in its rise, and unfortunately a role in it not being able to rise to power because it made some mistakes. So this is going to get complicated too. But,
yeah, like who's making the moves?
Yes.
And I mean, this is right. Like we've talked about,
I gotta say one last thing, but this is why I think there's also a part on our side, the freedom side, to tend to dismiss the possibility that workers can act independently, even if there is other sides getting in there, because I don't believe they believe in the revolutionary possibility of humanity and of working class. So they dismiss the possibility of that independence. And that part I disagree with them on. Like, yes, the capitalist is going to try to get in there for one way, shape, or form, whether it be to crush it or to amplify it so they can defeat their own enemy. But that doesn't change the fact that there may be something there that has to be replicated and worked from.
And honestly, like, to me, this is why these conversations are important, right? Like to try to, keep my mind sharpened, and be watchful, right? Like, and even then I'm going to be fooled, but, but because in order to understand how the world actually works, because they tell us it works in a certain way and we're bombarded with so much bullshit that, again, that to me, this is what I try to do here: unlearn certain things and try to see that in my life, I guess. But yeah, it's complicated. It's not a straight road. It's not it's not devoid of mistakes. It's or traps, right? Or it's not peaceful. And there is a cost to things if you want to change the world. And I generally don't look at the comments, but I did just took a peek at the episode, the last comment.
Yeah.
And someone brought up the question about how many people are you willing to die, kill in your revolution. And and then, and I think of Kwame Ture, where he talks about that there is no evidence in the history of humanity where progress has been made without this shedding of blood. The question is, whose blood is being shed and for what reason? And like, I don't want to change the world because I want to, kill people.
Right.
I don't, and I understand that death, that's not my goal. But I know that the people who want to prevent us from creating that world are willing to spill blood. And just like your mother said, right? Like the gardener that just is willing to kill all the fucking insects, in order to have beautiful flowers, their fucking flowers.
Yeah.
I want to have my fucking flowers.
Yeah.
I want us to have our own garden. Um, George Jackson also familiar, right? Like he was
Yeah,
in,
from Soledad brother. He was in the Soledad prison. He was a former Black Panther.
exactly. And he also talked about, like how that question, right? Like violence, revolution is violent, and uh, that's not the first thing I think of when I think of revolution. And I'm not unaware that that's how the processes of history work. you know, if fundamental changes, see a because that's what revolution is to me, a fundamental change of the dynamics of how society runs and is played, and who rules and for what reason, and all those questions. And so he talked about how like there's people dying every day. He says you just may not see it. It may be time to invite some others to do the dying also. Because I don't. That's the other thing, right? About especially living in the U.S. after having lived abroad, being born abroad. Uh, how much we don't see the level of violence that this system produces, the level of death that this system produces, the level of suffering. We are so bombarded with bullshit, like in propaganda, really, that you know hides that away. Even within our own country. You know, and so yeah, this is just I just wanted to kind of bring that up because it's a question that comes up in over and over, right? And this idea that history can be moved, you know, and systems can be changed without death, then I don't think then that there is a good understanding of how history works.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick look. Child dies from hunger every 10 seconds. This is just a quick search. How many die of starvation a year? Poor nutrition and hunger is responsible for the death of 3.1 million children a year. That's children. So we're talking every 2 years, there's a holocaust of children killed in our system. And it's just sort of, 6 million dead is a pretty important number, right? It's a number fished out of history from a violent event and where violence was perpetrated upon a people in the context of World War II as something that should never be repeated. It's repeated every 2 years. Easy, like, and it's so. This is the world we live in. I don't know what you want to call it. People want to say that that's not fascism. I don't give a shit. It's capitalism. Capitalism is the most violent thing we live in, and I honestly don't give a shit about fascism anymore. We live under capitalism. That's the thing that's going to be taken on, and it will. And if challenged, it will show you how violent it is if challenged. If you don't know how violent it is, we will find out because this system kills 3.1 million children every year. Sentenced to death. Sorry, not enough for you. There's enough. We're not giving it to you. We're going to make 5 billionaires. What are they said there were 5 billionaires who doubled their wealth in the last 4 years. Doubled their wealth and 5 billion across the globe who got poorer over the last 4 years. Okay, that's their system, dude, and that didn't just happen. That had to be organized, and so that's what has to be taken on. And when you take it on, those billionaires are not just going to sit there and go like, "Oh, it's all good. We'll share now." No, and it's not about killing them or anything like that. It's just they have organized their system around violence so it can produce this sort of inequity. So we're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with that lawnmower, the blades whirling around. We're going to put our fingers in there and try to stop it, and have the world not be a lawnmower of destruction. Well, you're going to have to deal with a lawnmower at some point.
And like, there's also this constant argument that you got to be grateful to live in the US, because it's not like those other places. And again, I don't think you're looking hard enough,
No.
and and that violence is not just like shooting someone on the head or dropping a bomb that it gets done, in other parts of the world, and like when we look at the state of this country, like the it's fucking madness, it,
Well,
it
and there's a reason we don't have a bunch of yellow vests. People are fucking afraid here. They're afraid not just of the state. They're afraid of homelessness. They're afraid of what they see around them, of how poverty, how far you can fall, and they wonder, unless I fucking do the right thing, I don't want to. There's no safety net. I'm going to fall through it. So workers are very afraid here,
mm,
and yes, they're afraid of repression, but they're really afraid of poverty. They're afraid of what they see around them, and it's not. They're not look. They don't live in Mexico. They don't live in Sudan. They live here, and they're afraid of the poverty they see
and
because they are worried that this is where they're going, and that's where we are all headed in some way, shape, or form into that kind of situation. We're all Palestinians.
yeah, and again, if so, I'm being cynical. So we have to be thankful, right, for the 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and not seeing our family or having mental issues, and being overly medicated and sedated by, all these social media, addictive injections that they give us, every fucking moment. And we need to be thankful for that until, right, like the literal, we get closer to those countries that we think we're different than, and because again, that's what we talk about, these systems, right? That's how what I see, that
Yeah,
systems of people management are coming because they're squeezing. 5 billion people became poor the last 4 years. They're squeezing hard.
yeah,
But we're thankful because we got a fucking shot and we were sent home, right? Like, and we have online learning and we have internet and other people don't.
yeah, yeah.
But
So we'll
I
see.
agree with
I
you.
think I I do believe more people are not as they're not as grateful, and there's some anger there. But I still wait to see it turned into something here in the United States. So we'll see. All right, Kenny. And just to be clear, folks, is I think if you've stayed with us this long, obviously we've talked way more than just about whatever Whitney Webb was talking about. Um, but I thank her. I thank Kim Iversen for asking those questions, having that interview. Thank Whitney Webb for having her answers. And we are listening to them in the same way that we hope our audience is listening to us, which is, what do I agree with? What do I disagree with? And then let's talk about it. And I think that's the spirit of what we're doing here. And so I do appreciate that she's putting her ideas out there. And I'm going to continue to read her stuff, although I hope we can find the article, that because she was talking about an article that she had written, not just her books. That's what Kim Iversen asked her about. So I just want to be clear with people about that.
But yeah, again, echoing what you're saying, those are important questions, conversations to be had, and they belong in every, you know, house, every living room. You know, we should not wait just for experts or us. Like, this is our opinion, right?
Yep.
Like you have to do your own shit, like, to figure this out, like, and bring something into the conversation, and like, but yeah, in the work that she does, she's not stupid. She's not like, you know, she's not canceled. We just have disagreements on some things that I think are important to address. And, again, this is my opinion. And, like, we should all have opinions and
Yep.
speak up.
Yep. All right, Kenny. Let's wrap up. Thank you again. Thanks for bringing this this other thing. This Kim Iversen, Whitney Webb interview to my attention, because I definitely enjoyed talking with you about it. And hopefully we'll have Eduardo here next week. I'm not even going to say we will, because I just don't know. All
Hopefully
right.
we have him from Colombia.
Yes. All right, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. If you like anything you've heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our 8 platforms on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, Bitchute, Odysee, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. And if you'd like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest for us to cover, please check with us on our blog. That's what'sleftpodcast.com. Anyway, Kenny, thank you very much. And for everyone else, we hope to see you this or next week, and we'll see what we talk about then. Take care.